So one of the things that I always feel so privileged to be able to do is to meet with people in times of loss and mourning. And we'll be sitting around the table in a funeral home or in someone's living room or whatever, and talking about this loved one who has just passed on. And there will be that deep experience of sorrow. And people's emotions are always complicated, and there's always that mix. And many of you have been the ones who have been there. And sometimes what's interesting is that even in that place of sorrow and sadness, people will start to laugh and to tell stories, right, about this person that's passed on. And I remember this is something that we experienced too when my mom passed away back in February. We're sitting around the table with the pastors in this church, and we're all sobbing and crying. But then we start telling stupid stories, right? And we start telling on ourselves all the things that we did, or that mom caught us on or called us on or whatever. And we're all like, we're laughing around the table at the same time that we're crying. And maybe you've experienced that set of emotions. I think this is a little bit of what Jesus is getting at, this surprising mix of sorrow and joy, this intensity of grief, but also this openness to joy. And Jesus, in John 16, maybe he was getting at that a little bit, because he's talking about joy again in the upper room. This is the second time. It's the same night. Last week we read from John 15. Here's John 16. And this is Jesus again saying that he desires his disciples' joy to be complete. And there he is at this intersection of joy and grief. And you know what? Jesus knows what's coming. He knows that the cross faces him the next day. And if his disciples knew that, then they probably would be crying. But they are unaware as of yet. And Jesus is saying, I want your joy to be complete. I'm going to the cross, but there's something else that's going on. And here, we're talking in our second of our series on joy, and we look at Jesus teaching on joy, and we see how even in this moment of potential deep grief, Jesus is teaching this way of life that encompasses all of what it means to be a human being. And his teaching is not just for the good times. Jesus' teaching is not just for the easy times. It is for all of life, and it includes sorrow. And I want to think about that, right? I want to think about how we can experience joy in the midst of sadness, because I think even in times of sadness, and maybe especially then, Jesus points to joy. And in this passage, Jesus ties the experience of joy to his death and to his resurrection. And what I think he's saying is this, that his resurrection presence brings joy. Now, if you've got your Bibles open, I'm going to walk through this just a little bit, but John chapter 16, in verse 16, Jesus says this, in a little while you will see me no more, and then after a little while you will see me. And he repeats that, if you look, he repeats that in verse 19. He repeats the question. So what does he mean? Well, in the Gospel of John, there are several times when Jesus repeats some variation of this phrase, a little while and you will no longer see me. So John 14:19. In a little while, the world will no longer see me, but you will see me. John 16:10, I'm going to the Father, and you will no longer see me. And then in this passage, it's actually repeated 3 times. So verse 16, verse 17, and verse 19. So Jesus, the disciples, and then Jesus again. And it's pretty clear, when you see something repeated, especially 3 times, it's pretty clear Jesus is driving this idea home. They will not see him, and then they will see him. And I think this is Jesus' way. You won't see me, then you will see me. It's this way of speaking about his death and resurrection. He's talking about the cross. He's saying, I'm going to die. You will not see me anymore. I'm going to be dead, but then I will be raised, and you will see me again. And he connects this to pain and to joy. When they do not see him, they will experience pain. When they see him again, they will experience joy. Verse 20, he says, your pain will be turned into joy. Then Jesus goes on, he uses a different image, right? So verse 21, if you're following me here, he says, a woman giving birth to a child has pain because her time has come. But when her baby is born, she forgets the anguish because of her joy that a child is born into the world. Now, the Apostle Paul also uses this image of being in labor. He talks about that in his letters. Paul says the whole creation is groaning in labor pains until the revelation of the children of God, the time of Christ, right? He says that the end of the world is going to be like labor pains. And all of this is connected because Jesus and Paul are getting at this idea that the work of salvation, which is accomplished on the cross, this mighty act of God, that's something that God accomplishes, it's going to happen through pain. It's going to happen through hardship. It's going to happen through struggle. It's this kind of labor. It's this birthing of a whole new reality, this kingdom reality. It's bringing salvation into the world, and it's painful. Verse 22, Jesus says, "Now is your time of grief, but I will see you again, and you will rejoice, and no one will take away your joy." But it leads to that joy. So there's this pain, and there's this joy, and they're connected. And if you think about it, these are really bracing words. Jesus is telling the disciples that they're going to experience pain. He's saying, you're going to experience loss. He's saying, you're going to feel like a mother struggling and laboring to bring her child into the world. It's going to be hard. It's going to be painful. It's going to be sad. It's going to be traumatic. Jesus has in mind the crucifixion. He knows what's coming. But even so, verse 22, he says, your hearts will rejoice and no one will take your joy from you. Then he adds a third image to this discussion. He says, he talks about asking and receiving. He says that until now, they have never asked anything in his name, but on that day they will ask for whatever they want, and the Father will give whatever they ask in his name. And all of this winds into verse 24, which says, your hearts will rejoice, and no one will take your joy from you. Right? This asking and receiving. Verse 24, asking you will receive, and your joy will be complete. Your joy is complete. So there's these three images. The pain of not seeing, then the joy of seeing again. Second image, the pain of childbirth, and then the joy of new life, and then the not asking yet, but asking and receiving in the future, and that receiving brings joy. What's this all about? Well, I think the first piece, we're talking about joy. I think the first piece is that joy often comes through suffering, or surprisingly, joy sometimes comes in the midst of suffering. And when Jesus tells the disciples that in a little while they will not see him, what he means is that in a little while he will die. He will not be present to them. His body will lay in the grave. And when he says that in a little while the disciples will be sad, but that the world will rejoice, what he's saying is that his death will bring them sorrow, but to the forces of evil in the world, it will give them joy, because they will believe that they have triumphed. But it is not a triumph for them. For Jesus is the willing victim who lays down his life of his own accord. Jesus is the one who turns the dead wood of the cross into the tree of life. They will not see him, but in a little while they will see him again, because he will be raised. And in his resurrection, they will find joy. There's this light at the end of the tunnel. But Jesus is telling them first off that there is going to be a tunnel. And before you find the light at the end of the tunnel, you first got to find the tunnel. But the darkness they will experience, that is not the whole story. Death is not the whole story. There will be renewed life, and he is calling and urging and drawing them forward to that renewed life. There will be resurrection, and then they will rejoice. And I sort of said this last week, right? But one of the strange things about joy is that people often encounter it in the midst of sorrow, right? In fact, the late, great Orthodox priest Alexander Schmemann, he speaks of joy radiating through the world as a bright sorrow. And joy will show up at the oddest times, in the midst of loss, at the heart of the storm, in a time of turmoil, in the face of death. It's because joy doesn't come from within us. And we can be roiled and sad inside of us, but that joy will break through. It comes from outside, which is why joy always has this surprising element. And so what Jesus is doing right here in this second time that he talks about joy in the upper room with the disciples, what he's doing is something that is eminently practical. He's trying to lay out this roadmap for them. He's saying, you're going to be sad. He's saying, frankly, you're going to be devastated. But listen, don't think that's the whole story. That's not the end. Jesus is saying, listen, think of it as when you're lost in darkness and then suddenly you say, see. Think of it as a woman who experiences the pain of childbirth, but then the joy of a new human being coming into the world. Think of it as ignorance and not knowing what you want, or even knowing what to ask, and then suddenly knowing and asking and seeing how God responds. Jesus is saying, think of it that way. There is a light at the end of the tunnel, Jesus is saying. He's saying, keep that light in front of you. Jesus is saying, develop a light at the end of the tunnel vision. A vision that always sees that light at the end of the tunnel. Develop that, Jesus is saying. Light at the end of the tunnel vision. He's trying to reframe what is happening, what's about to happen for the disciples. Now, how much of that is possible? How much the disciples could really grasp? Who knows? But the cross is forever to be seen in the light of the resurrection. And what this means for us is that we've got to keep life in perspective. What this means is that whatever sadness we experience, whatever brokenness we encounter, whatever woundedness we are carrying within us, those things are real and we don't have to pretend they're not there, but they are not the whole story. There's a light at the end of the tunnel, and Jesus is calling us to light at the end of the tunnel vision. And it's not that we got to go around kind of as cheery optimists, just, always optimistic about everything. It's not that we have to say, oh, it'll all turn out all right. It'll all come out in the wash. Because sometimes it doesn't, right? Sometimes the worst happens. Sometimes it does not turn out okay, and it does not come out in the wash. The loved ones, a loved one will die unexpectedly. Or we really do lose something or lose someone, or we do really experience the loss of a beautiful state of affairs, and it hurts. And I think Jesus is a realist. Jesus saw life the way it really was, and he was unafraid to look at the worst of life and humanity. But at the same time, Jesus didn't allow the worst to define him. He kept coming back to his unbreakable relationship with God the Father. He kept pointing to the really real of the kingdom. Jesus knew that there was more to reality than sadness and brokenness, and he was open to that deeper reality, which meant he was open to joy. And I don't know if you've experienced this. My guess is that many of you have, that you'll be going through a time of loss and sadness, and suddenly you will encounter joy. Or at least you'll have the spiritual wherewithal to be able to sense that there is more to life than whatever brokenness is trying to define you in that moment. You'll sense that there's a light at the end of the tunnel, at least just a little faint glimmer. I mean, I've been there. You see that glimmer up ahead in the darkness, and you run after that glimmer as if your life depends on it, because maybe it does. I think about the story of Paul Kalanithi. Paul Kalanithi was a young surgeon who developed an aggressive form of cancer. And at some point, it became clear that he was not going to recover. And he was not going to beat it. And despite the optimistic assurances that his oncologist gave him, he was convinced that it wasn't going to happen. Dr. Kalanithi knew he was dying. And he wrote a book about his experience, and it was published after his death, and it went on to become a bestseller. Maybe some of you have read this book, When Breath Becomes Air. And there he was, this young man, at the beginning of a promising career, recently married. Amazingly, in the last year of his life, his wife became pregnant. They had a little daughter. And there's Kalanithi. He concludes his book with some words to his infant daughter. I'm going to probably make myself cry, but I'm going to put up on the screen. And he knows he's going to lose it all. Wife, daughter, career. He knows he's going to lose his life. And he writes this to his daughter. He says, "When you come to one of the many moments in life where you must give an account of yourself, provide a ledger of what you have been and done and meant to the world, do not, I pray, discount that you filled a dying man's days with a sated joy, a joy unknown to me in all my prior years. A joy that does not hunger for more and more, but rests satisfied. In this time, right now, this is an enormous thing." Now that shouldn't be possible, right? That should not be possible to experience joy like Dr. Kalanithi did in the midst of all his loss. But there he is, holding his baby daughter, knowing he's about to die, and he can still somehow talk about knowing joy? How? Well, I think some of it is God's gracious action to us no matter who we are and where we're at in our spiritual journey. And I would not find it surprising that people who have no relationship to God whatsoever can still experience some moments like this. But Dr. Kalanithi was also a Christian. And I think there's the possibility of knowing joy in the midst of loss will always be limited by how much we know Jesus. And he was able to encounter that joy because of his sometimes stumbling walk behind Jesus. I think many of us have seen people who in the last weeks or days of life shut the world out, maybe shut God out, who descend into bitterness, who recriminate God or others. And that happens too. It's the opposite of this. And I think that the reality is that without Jesus' resurrected presence, we will not be able to open ourselves up to the possibility of joy, at least not whole with wholeness, and especially in sorrow. I think it all comes back to what Jesus said in verse 24. Until now you have not asked for anything in my name. Ask and you will receive, and your joy will be complete. What are they asking for? Well, in part, Jesus is referring to the reality that after his death and resurrection, he will be seated at the right hand of the Father to intercede for us. This is John 14:13, where he says, I will do whatever you ask in my name, so that the Father may be glorified in the Son. But the greater reality, and the way that this is connected to our experience with joy, is that when we ask for Jesus' resurrected presence, for God's presence is always connected to God's name, then Jesus will hear and respond and draw near to us. We will experience joy, some thin sliver of joy in hardships, because when we call out to God, he will come and journey with us. Jesus' resurrected presence brings joy. Now you see this already playing out in the Bible. So think about the stories after Jesus' resurrection. Think about Cleopas and his wife who are walking on the road towards the village of Emmaus in Luke chapter 24. And Jesus has been crucified. And their hopes have been shattered. And as far as they're concerned, the gig is up. They're done with all this. They're leaving. It's time to move on. But Jesus comes and walks with them. Jesus asks them questions. Jesus talks about the scriptures with them and opens up the scriptures. He teaches them, and they do not recognize him until he sits down with them and breaks bread with them and shares life with them in the bread, just as he said he would do in that upper room. And Cleopas and his wife, they offer up this prayer. And the interesting thing is, in that moment, they don't realize that it's Jesus who's walking with them, and neither do they realize that they're praying. They say this, it's in Luke chapter 24. They say, stay with us, because it is almost evening, and the day is now nearly over. And Jesus does. That's really how this works. There's nothing wrong for asking for joy. You just ask for it straight up. Lord, I want to be happy. Lord, I want to experience joy in my life. I need that. I need you to break through the stuff I've been going through. I want to experience joy. There's nothing wrong with asking for joy, but if we really want to experience joy, then what we're truly asking for is Jesus. What we're asking him to do is to do what he did on that road to Emmaus, and to come and walk beside us and to be present to us and lead us and teach us and guide us. And that brings joy. When Jesus walked with those downcast disciples on the road to Emmaus, he asked them questions. And I think this is how it's going to work a lot of times. We have to be open to the questions. And it's going to be a question. It can be a question that we have for ourselves. Where is Jesus showing up in my life? Where am I experiencing joy right now and maybe not even noticing it? But I think it's also a question that we can put to each other, especially when somebody's going through a tough spot. We can ask somebody, we can say, hey, where have you experienced joy in all of this? Or if we're not quite that confident or daring, we can say, have you experienced any joy in all of this? It's the questions. And I'm convinced that it is possible to experience joy and struggle and loss and suffering. And I'm convinced of this because I think this is exactly what Jesus has shown us. He's shown us the way, and it's not joy as an opiate that dulls our pain, or joy as a way out that saves us for having to experience loss. It's joy that comes from asking in Jesus' name, just as he taught, for the one thing that is needful, which is himself, his presence. Reflecting on his own life and wandering journey, St. Augustine spoke about discovering true joy. And we're always coming back to Augustine these days. But Augustine, he talked about joy, and he said he had sought joy and success. Augustine of Hippo was this individual who lived in the 4th century, and he was on the road to success, right? And he had sought joy in becoming this orator in Rome, this teacher who would make the big bucks. He sought joy in dabbling in exotic philosophy, something called Manichaeism. He sought joy in the delights of the flesh. But after he had tried it all, he found that he still had not reached the end of his journey and discovered what he was looking for. And Augustine said, he said this of joy, as he writes in kind of a conversation with God, and he said this: "This is the authentic happy life, to set one's joy on you." He's talking to God. "To set one's joy on you, grounded in you, and caused by you. This is the real thing, and there is no other." Joy comes from Jesus, and Jesus comes to us in places of pain and brokenness. That's the real thing. There is no other, and that's why we experience joy in him at those seemingly impossible moments, because you see, there is a light at the end of the tunnel, and we got to keep that light before us. We got to follow it and get our bearings from it. There is joy. This is the real thing. There is no other. Wherever you're at, wherever you're going, and whatever you're going through, there's that light at the end of the tunnel, and it's Jesus.